This is part one of a three-part video series covering the changes proposed under the Burlington Neighborhood Code. The Neighborhood Code is supported by a bylaw modernization grant from the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development and in collaboration with and in-kind support from AARP Vermont's Livable Communities program. The Neighborhood Code is a series of zoning amendments that will enable more neighborhood-scale housing types citywide, including duplex, triplex, and four-unit buildings, as well as townhomes and other small multi-unit building types in some locations around the city. Specifically, the code aims to re-legalize historic neighborhood development patterns and identify solutions to common barriers to small and middle housing types, find opportunities to build on neighborhood patterns through more context-sensitive zoning tools for residential areas, recommend new approaches to the type of development allowed in low-density zoned areas along major streets served by transit and connecting neighborhoods to downtown, and lastly, comply with and exceed the minimum standards for residential density and residential uses required by the Vermont Legislature's Act 47 of 2023. Neighborhood-scale housing refers to certain housing types such as duplexes, fourplexes, and cottage courts that are not currently able to be built in Burlington's residential areas due to zoning regulations. The Neighborhood Code is about how these housing types can fit alongside existing buildings within these residential areas. These neighborhood-scale housing types are often called the missing middle because the buildings that they refer to, such as ADUs, duplexes, fourplexes, and clusters of small homes on larger lots, were once created in many historic, walkable neighborhoods, but have become increasingly difficult or illegal to build since the mid-1900s. The 2021 Housing Action Plan established a goal of 1,250 new homes within the city by 2026, essentially doubling the rate of growth from the previous 5 years. This goal is 1/4 of the regional housing goal, which has been established based on chronically low housing vacancy rates, the statewide housing needs assessment, and other market and demographic factors in our area. Burlington is a well-established city, with the vast majority of developable lots already being utilized, and a significant portion of the land area dedicated to essential natural and recreational systems. While there's very little vacant land for new development, there are many opportunities to retrofit properties that have already been developed through infill and redevelopment. Plan BTV provides a framework for what type and scale of development should occur in those different parts of the city. While not the only factor, zoning has a major influence on our ability to meet our housing production goals and implement this land use framework. Plan BTV guides changes to zoning laws by identifying areas that we're planning to conserve, sustain, and grow. Many recent residential zoning changes have focused on these areas pictured in gold, areas planned for the most intensive future growth such as downtown and other mixed-use areas. However, not all of these areas in gold are intended for residential use. They include our public school sites and other areas like most of the South End, which is not intended for residential development. An area that we've paid particular attention to with planning and zoning changes for many years now is the downtown, but that represents just a fraction of the city's total land area. Even as there are ways that we can create more homes within these areas, they focus on mostly larger-scale multifamily housing. While we've been successful in adding about 1,300 new homes across the city over the last decade, the vast majority of them have been in new apartment developments, and we know that these locations and types of developments don't necessarily meet the housing needs of all Burlington residents. Burlington and its residents take great care to protect and conserve our natural areas. These areas in green make up approximately 40% of the city's total land area and is dedicated to conserving public and private open spaces, plant or wildlife habitats, agriculture, or other important natural resources. The city recognizes how important it is to maintain these natural areas and therefore prohibits residential development from taking place. The Neighborhood Code is focused on smaller-scale housing opportunities within the city's residentially zoned areas, which account for the remaining 40% of the city's land area. Plan BTV anticipates that there will be incremental changes in these areas that are consistent with existing development patterns, which will enable these neighborhoods to evolve to meet the needs of current and future households. Neighborhood-scale housing not only offers more choices for households within existing neighborhoods, but also helps meet local and regional housing needs within areas that are already developed, thus reducing some of the pressure for growth in undeveloped areas around the region. Enabling more homes in these areas will also help support the city's sustainability goals, making better use of existing public infrastructure and bringing more homes to areas where people can walk, bike, and use transit. In Burlington, we have strong connections to our neighborhoods, from their unique patterns and architectural features to their link to the city's history and sense of place, as well as to the people that live in them. They're also special to us because these neighborhoods can be places that support the needs of current and future households in Burlington and help us respond to our chronic and emerging housing challenges and even make tangible efforts to address the climate emergency. In fact, Plan BTV recognizes the opportunity for our neighborhoods to evolve in incremental ways in order to meet these needs. The neighborhood code is all about how we can do that. Today, about 2/3 of our residential areas are in zoning districts where there are a number of barriers preventing more middle housing choices. Though allowing more neighborhood-scale homes on its own will not achieve all of the city's equity, housing, financial, and sustainability goals, it's an important complement to other solutions. While it is likely that creating these new homes will be an incremental process that takes place over many years, particularly without programs and initiatives that will help overcome other non-regulatory barriers, these housing types will be an important part of our city's housing mix in the future. In fact, many of these housing types can be found in many of the city's neighborhoods today. These housing choices provide greater socioeconomic integration and create new models for multi-generational housing and aging in place. These units use less land per home and can be more cost-effective to build than single-family homes, and can help expand the tax base and address the residential tax burden in a largely built-out city. As a result of this infill development, new homes can also utilize existing utility and transportation infrastructure within the city as opposed to continuing the patterns of urban sprawl that have been seen in the region in the past decades. These are the housing types that the neighborhood code is focused on. Very few of these housing types are explicitly allowed, and for many of those that are theoretically allowed today, the standards present major roadblocks to realizing them. For example, due to the small lot sizes in many city neighborhoods, duplexes are effectively prohibited on many lots. Primarily throughout the residential low-density zones, current rules related to minimum lot size and density limit the ability of many lots to have a duplex. In fact, in low-density residential districts, you need more than a quarter acre, or about 12,000 square feet of land to have a duplex. Meanwhile, the median lot size in these areas is only about 9,000 square feet. A pattern shown in these maps is that many of the lots that are large enough to accommodate duplexes today are actually on the edges of the city, further from the walkable core and major corridors served by transit and planned for improved bike connections. Even some areas of the city where duplexes may be part of this historic fabric, such as Five Sisters, don't have lots large enough for a duplex according to current zoning standards. The neighborhood code's goal is to make it more feasible for these housing options to be built across the city. While the neighborhood code overall is seeking to make it easier to build these, we know that zoning changes alone won't resolve all the challenges that might exist. In the Joint Committee's work and in other stakeholder conversations we've had over the last year, we know that things like cost of land and cost of new construction, building codes, utility connections, and other realities will mean that these will still be hard to create in many cases. And while we've had success in our work to support ADUs in the last years, we've seen just several dozen new ADUs created since. We expect that these changes could support hundreds of new homes citywide over time, an important addition to our housing stock, but certainly not as intensive growth that could still be achieved in other mixed-use areas of the city. Since the city announced the 2021 Housing Action Plan with the goal to allow more housing types citywide, the state legislature also passed a 2023 bill, commonly referred to as the Home Act. The act made a number of changes to the zoning rules municipalities can use when it comes to what types of housing are allowed. While Burlington's residential zoning rules already achieve several of the goals of the Home Act zoning provisions, there are some notable changes that the city must make to comply with this new law. Notably, the city can no longer require larger lots for duplexes than it does for single-family homes, and it must allow 3- and 4-unit buildings in residential districts. Both of these changes require a new approach to the zoning standards for some areas of the city, particularly the residential low-density zones. Video 2 will explain more about how these new requirements, as well as the broader goals of the neighborhood code, are reflected in the proposed changes. These middle housing options present opportunities for more of the city's households to have access to housing types that meet their needs within their existing neighborhoods. Households' needs change over time, including how many people live together, requirements for space, and how much of its income can be spent on housing costs. Like many places across the country, the makeup of the city's households has been changing. And as these needs change and evolve, diverse housing choice must be available to address the changing needs of residents and households. Between 2010 and 2020, the city's population grew 5% to 44,873 and was accompanied by some shifts in household composition, shifts that are not necessarily new or unique to Burlington. In fact, as far back as the city's 1962 comprehensive plan, it was recognized that these household dynamics were changing, particularly that households were getting smaller. Today, early career adults, young homeowners, and residents at retirement age make up 1/3 of Burlington's population. There is also an increase in households that are made up of individuals or unrelated persons living together. This means that we're seeing an increase in households made up of roommates, unmarried partners, people in shared living arrangements, or people in senior housing. These households increased by 5% over the last decade, making up just over 60% of all households in 2020. While these housing types are not anticipated to dramatically change the city's neighborhoods, enabling greater diversity in the housing types allowed across the city can provide more housing types that correspond to the city's changing demographics, any of whom middle housing types can be well suited for. The type of homes and neighborhoods that renters and owners live in can also vary across the city. While the majority of households in Burlington, about 62%, are renter-occupied, approximately 40% of the land zoned for residential uses is occupied by single-family homes. And the overwhelming majority of these homes, about 77%, are owner-occupied. Combined with historic zoning and development patterns, this means that housing types in the neighborhoods where people can live closely correspond with other household demographic factors, particularly race and income. The median income for renter households in 2021 was $59,331, while the median income for owner-occupied households is $113,750. Additionally, white households own their homes at higher rates than any other race. While many off-campus students live in rental households, 70% of rental households include individuals 25 and over. While the city has inclusionary zoning requirements that require a certain percentage of units to be permanently affordable within new multi-unit developments, and a housing trust fund that provides financial support to create and preserve affordable housing citywide, middle housing can be a tool to expand more naturally occurring affordable housing. In some cities, middle housing has been a tool to help incrementally expand owner and renter housing options for households that earn between 80 and 120% of the area median income, with less subsidy needed. When the first zoning ordinance was adopted in Burlington in 1947, it included just one residential zoning district. Like many cities at the time, this district allowed for a mix of housing types, including single-family and multifamily homes, rooming houses, and apartment buildings. Approximately half of all existing residential buildings in the city were originally developed several generations ago, prior to the adoption of the first zoning ordinance. The residential zone allowed for various housing types and tailored some typical zoning standards like lot size and building height to the housing types themselves rather than all development within the district. Many of the city's oldest residential properties were built to suit the needs of households at the start of the 20th century, such as to accommodate large or extended families or as housing for workers as the economy grew. These factors are foundational to the city's historic neighborhoods and shed light on why many feature a diversity of housing types that seemingly coexist within and define their vibrant character. So when the 1947 ordinance first went into effect, the vast majority of those residential properties that had already been developed became nonconforming because of new requirements for minimum lot size and width, which were larger than what was already created. Despite this, the earliest zoning ordinance still provided some flexibility for residential lots yet to be developed. The adoption of the first zoning ordinance also coincided with the beginning of a significant post-World War II housing boom in the U.S. and Burlington that would shape the growing New North End with primarily single-family homes. Changes to Burlington zoning laws throughout the latter half of the 20th century ultimately pared back the housing types permitted in existing neighborhoods and introduced standards that limited what could be built in areas yet to be developed. These factors contribute significantly to why certain neighborhood-scale housing types are now primarily considered missing. It was the 1973 zoning ordinance that split the city's residential areas into 5 individual residential zoning districts, a framework that's still in place today. These districts distinguish the types of homes allowed in different neighborhoods, ultimately limiting most residential areas to single-family homes and duplexes. This ordinance also introduced the concept of maximum density standards, which limit the number of homes on a lot based on that lot size, and began to apply lot coverage and setback standards to all development throughout the entire district. This ordinance also introduced a requirement to have at least 2 parking spaces per housing unit. A major zoning update in 1994 resulted in downzoning central areas of Burlington, virtually outlawing all missing middle housing types in large portions of the city. Notable changes included requiring very high minimum lot sizes of almost 10,000 square feet, up from the 6,000 square feet for a single-family home that had been the standard for the nearly 50-year history of the city's zoning, prohibited duplexes in low-density districts, reduced the allowable densities for medium and high-density districts, which included a reduction by almost half in the high-density district, reduce the overall area of the city that was within the medium and high density zoning districts, and thus expanding the residential low density zone, and introduce standards that enabled building multi-unit buildings on primarily lots 2 acres or more. These changes incentivize building on the low and high ends of the housing density spectrum, leaving behind middle housing types for large portions of Burlington. These zoning changes throughout the last century ultimately pared back the housing types that could be created in existing neighborhoods and introduced new standards that limited what could be built in areas that were not yet developed. These changes to residential development standards has resulted in a mismatch between what exists on the ground in Burlington's residential neighborhoods and what is currently permitted to be built. This mismatch has created widespread nonconformities for existing homes and lots, in some cases impacting large swaths of historic neighborhoods. While the city's zoning laws do not require nonconformities to be remedied immediately, these nonconformities create limits for how properties can evolve over time. Subsequent zoning revisions have reintroduced some flexibility into the city's residential districts. While not as permissive of diverse housing types as the 1947 zoning laws, Burlington's 2008 ordinance corrected some of the 20th century's suburbanization trends. Notably, all districts now allow for at least duplexes and accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, in addition to single-family homes. City housing action plans from the late 2010s and early 2020s have also identified further actions that the city should implement to address both chronic and emerging housing challenges. Despite some improvement to these rules, current zoning can still limit a range of housing types that can be accommodated in different neighborhoods throughout the city. For example, this is the lot in the New North End, which currently houses a single-family home on a 1-acre lot. The example design arranges new freestanding homes in various sizes around a central green with the existing house as an anchor, and also includes parking and residential amenities. Cottage courts, or sometimes called pocket neighborhoods, offer smaller homes with communal amenities. The new small detached homes reflect the pattern of small to mid-sized single-family homes throughout the neighborhood. Cottage courts create additional housing options for rental or homeownership, as well as for extended family, multi-generational living, or intentional communities. However, current zoning standards prohibit this amount of freestanding units in low-density residential neighborhoods, and the lot size is too small to utilize existing planned unit development processes that would allow it to develop as a condo or rental community. Additionally, this lot, located on North Avenue, currently houses a large parking lot and a duplex on a 1/4-acre corner lot. In this concept, a fourplex is located at the corner on part of what is an existing parking lot. This is an example of how to create new homes along one of the main GMT bus routes and near neighborhood serving amenities in the Hannaford Shopping Center. Because it's on a corner lot, building entries are able to be placed facing both streets, which provides for an active street frontage, ADA accessible entrances, and off-street parking that's largely hidden from North Avenue. The buildings in this scenario provide a transition between North Avenue and surrounding residential areas. From the street view, the building height, width, and features are similar to buildings in the area. However, under today's rules, lots in the low-density district are not permitted to have more than one building or accommodate buildings with 3 or more residential units. While middle housing types were an original element to some of the earliest neighborhoods in Burlington, examples can be found throughout the city, from the abundant variety of neighborhood-scale housing types in the Old North End to brand-new duplexes on North Avenue in the New North End. While there are many examples of these housing types in the city, modern zoning laws have increasingly made these types of housing more difficult to replicate. The Neighborhood Code aims to identify context-sensitive zoning solutions that enable more neighborhood-scale housing types in residential areas of Burlington. In order to do so, the Office of City Planning identified some of the basic building blocks that define the neighborhood's built patterns. The physical characteristics like how big a lot is, how far homes are set back from the street, how much of a lot is occupied by buildings, and how many homes are in those buildings. Parts 2 and 3 of this video series are available on the Office of City Planning website and cover topics including what the current residential zoning standards are today, what the Neighborhood Code proposes to change, and what changes are proposed to the existing residential zoning district boundaries.